The Intelligent Pursuit of God, with your host and author, Bruce S. Campbell. A program about understanding God and learning to love Him with all our heart, soul, and mind.
Thanks for tuning back in. We're actually doing a second segment today because we didn't quite get through on the last segment. If you're tuning in for the first time, this is called The Intelligent Pursuit of God, and we welcome you to the program. It's a program where we want to think about the things of God and to understand that we're to love God with our whole mind, our whole soul, our whole heart, and that God has invited us to the conference table to discuss life. And so that's what we're doing. We're going to ask you to send in questions, if you have them, about the most difficult things that you've come across in the Bible, or if you don't know God, you think this is all a bunch of religious hype. What we want you to do is send in your questions, the things that have hindered you from being able to believe that God is real and that He's true. So this is a show for you, and it's to help you to understand. We've been dealing with some things, and we didn't quite get through it, and this is actually from the week before. This is going to be a continuation of that segment. But we're talking about the enemy of God, which was a child of God, still is to this day, by the way. God's gifts and calling are irrevocable, but his son, that was at one time his son Lucifer, became something else. He was full of rebellion, and he began to understand that he wanted to be like God, and he felt like God was holding out. So we were at that segment last time, and we just want to pick up from there if we possibly can to understand how it is that God basically taught creation, his angels, the difference between right and wrong. Prior to Lucifer bringing into existence this thing called sin, there was no such thing. The angels were created eternal. So let's read a few passages. We're going to go to Galatians chapter 3, verse 19. And it says, "What purpose does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions. Till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, it was appointed through the angels by the hand of a mediator." Okay? And that means that the law was given in the flesh later, but there was also law given in the Spirit. And in Galatians 3:24 it says, "Therefore the law was our tutor." Now what is a tutor? A teacher, right? And so the law was to teach creation what sin was. Sin, they didn't have a clue. Now can you imagine being born with absolutely no possibility of suffering or pain or hatred or unkindness, or death, or disease, or infirmity? None of it existed. I mean, it's almost unimaginable to us, isn't it? I mean, it's crazy to think about that, and yet that's how life was until iniquity was found in Lucifer. So he brings about this questioning of God. Now, let's read also Romans 7:7 and through 12, and it says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead." All right, even though Lucifer was sinning, it was not imputed to him as sin. Why? There was no law. Why was there no law? There was no need for law. Does that make sense? It's unimaginable to us, isn't it? Wow. But we need to understand, and we're going to progress along to help us to understand how did we get here from there, and we're going to talk about that. So he says then, that I was alive once without the law. But when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. The law brings death. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me and by it killed me. Therefore, the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Now, that's a lot of wordy stuff there, isn't it? But let's analyze it for just a minute. That God had to teach creation what exactly sin was. The tool that he used was a diagnostic tool called the law. It's kind of like when you go to a doctor and the doctor pokes and he prods and he says, does it hurt here? No. What he's doing is he is prodding and poking so that he can give a diagnosis of what's wrong. Well, what was happening is that God created the law as a way of diagnosing for all of the angelic host what sin was, and then they were given the freedom to choose. Okay? But there's a catch. There's a catch. If you choose to pursue the disease of evil, the knowledge of good and what? Evil. There's only one way you can know evil. You have to experience it. And once you get it, you cannot unlearn it. If you stick your hand in the fire and burn your hand, can you unlearn that? You probably aren't going to want to do it again if you're smart, right? So you cannot, and here's the problem. Because those angels were created eternal, the choice to pursue the knowledge of evil came with an eternal cost. And that eternal cost was separation from the spirit of love forever. And that what you seek is so bad that one day I will have to take you children and I'll have to put you away forever. You know, I don't think they believed him. Because it wasn't until much later in this reality that man was created, and then we find that some angels left their first estate and came down to earth and began to monkey in the affairs of men, that it was done. Because then those angels were captured and they were chained and thrown into the bottomless pit until the last days. And I think it shook up all of the angels. Ooh, we have to do everything according to God's will, or we could end up the same way. How do we know that? Because we find in the scriptures all throughout the will of God is absolute in the spirit kingdom. How so? How about the angel of death? The last enemy of God. Didn't we talk about that? And what will the angel of death get? He'll be the last angel thrown into the lake of fire, even after the devil. That's what he'll get for his rebellion. And yet he cannot resist the will of God because he now has a new nature. He's second in command under Lucifer. There's a hierarchy in the demonic realm. There's Satan, the angel of death, Hades. I thought Hades was a place. Hades is a prison keeper. He's an angel. He rides in the last days on the horse. You remember? We don't understand these things. These all have spiritual realities to them. And we have to understand, if we're going to understand the ways of God, we've got to understand how God did it and why God did it. Now, when those angels rebelled and they left their first estate, I believe it sent shockwaves through the entire universe. Because for the first time, there was no more freedom to go off and go crazy. All of a sudden, God reined it all in and said, enough. Boom! All those angels. And what happened to them? Those that sought evil then, and God not only destroyed the earth, but he threw all of those spirits into prison. And then it's kind of like, can you imagine? We don't understand Lucifer because the thing about Satan is that God created the law, and now all things are dictated by the law. So here's how it works. Satan, I'm going to allow you to have your experiment. and something that I call the great experiment of sin. I'm going to allow all of my children to make a choice. Now, here's the rules. The rules is I'm going to dictate how this happens. And as long as you play by the rules, by the law, then you'll have authority. 1 Corinthians 15:56 says that the power of sin is the law. So here's how it works in the spirit realm. Satan goes to the law of God and he brings forth an accusation. God says, you're correct. It is so under the law. Let me give you a little example of that. Remember when he sifted Peter? Jesus said, just before he's going to the cross, Peter, Peter, Satan has requested to sift you as wheat. So think about that for a moment. What that means is that the enemy of God, which is a strange thing because it's his child, his rebellious, wayward son is coming into his presence and he's making accusation according to God's own law in order to bring forth destruction in people's lives. Why? Because if they reject love, they come under his authority. He's God. Does that make sense? So Lucifer's desire is to bring all of mankind under subjection to his rulership over us. Now, I realize I've jumped way ahead from where I want to go, but, there's some rabbits and I felt like chasing them. So we have basically, let's go back to that law for a minute, that it is by the law that Satan gains his authority, and the rule book is the law. So here's how it goes. Satan comes before the Father and he says, well, now, Dad, did you not say that he who sins is the servant of sin? You know what the Father will say? It is so. Therefore, Father, under your law, I have authority over them. You know what God will say? It is so. And so the enemy will go out from the presence of God, and he will entrap us by the law. Sin takes what? Occasion by the law, and thereby slew me. So, Christians, beware. If you're listening in from television, we've been taught a lot of bad theology. We've been taught to try to create an eternal reality and make it into the temporal. What does that mean? That means that Peter did not get for one moment to escape the sifting process. But he's an apostle of Christ. And why? The confession of Peter is what the church was built on. By golly, this is a great man of God. And I mean, he had miracles and oh my gosh, Peter, what a wait a minute. God's no respecter of persons. We're all equal under the law of God. Every one of us. He's no respecter of persons. So, if you violate the law, here's the truth. The law of grace, thankfully, is also in here. But God created the law, which was the governing rule book on how things in the realm of the Spirit are done. Now, we'll have guests on in some later programs, people that have been delivered from demons. And we're going to have them tell you their stories. And how those spirits under the authority of Satan can have access into people's lives. And it's all based in God's law. So we want law and grace, but what we do is we confuse them. Because the law of grace is your salvation through Jesus Christ and through his blood. That law of grace is applied to you on the eternal perspective. Isn't that a good thing? But in the temporal, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, I have not come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. And he said, I also tell you the truth in another place, that not one jot or tittle of the law shall be done away with until all things are fulfilled. But wait a minute, preacher, I'm not under the law, I'm under grace. Yeah, on an eternal scale. But see, we have two realities functioning here. One's eternal and one's temporal. So if you violate God's law in the flesh, there will unleash on your life demonic forces that will come after you and do their best to utterly destroy you. They will absolutely. And all you have to do is violate the law. Well, what law are we talking about? Is it the law of cleaning your hands? You know, when you have to wash your hands 7 times? You know, there's a lot of laws. We're a little confused about that. Well, the laws that God gave us were also not just given to us in the Old Testament. And by the way, you don't have to wash your hands, okay, 7 times. If you're a Gentile and stuff like that, if you touch a dead thing, the law prescribed that you should wash your hands and you should do all this stuff. And I just want you to know today that if you pick up dead animals and you don't wash your hands, that, you know, you haven't sinned. I really wouldn't recommend it, you know, especially if you eat after. Yeah. Everything God did, he did for a purpose. Does that make sense? I mean, listen, you can talk and wax eloquent about your theologies, but when Jesus said, not one jot or tittle of the law shall be done away with, why? Because everything that violates God's law has an effect in our temporal flesh. So when Jesus said, or when the law said in the Old Testament, don't eat this and don't eat that, it's unclean, don't eat this. For them, it was law and it was sin. For us, we have the freedom to do it. But let me tell you something, everything that he said don't do, there's a wisdom to that that's unbelievable. If you eat too much shellfish and you do, there's bad stuff that begins to happen in the body. You know, people talk about getting gout and all that, and then what do they? Stay off all shellfish. Well, God said a long time ago, I don't eat too much shellfish. If I've got freedom, it's not sin, but I also know that I want to honor and respect God, because if he said don't do it, it's a smart thing not to do it. Does that make sense? And so when Jesus said not one jot or tittle of the law shall be done away with, he meant it. So if you're speeding down the road and the cops pull you over and they're writing out a ticket, just try that I'm not under the law stuff as he's writing it. All right? Let's see how far that'll get you. All right? If, in fact, the law is no longer something that we have to concern ourselves with, then just go off sinning rampantly and see how that works out for you. Well, it didn't work out too good for Ananias and Sapphira, did it? No, not so good. Didn't work out too good for the Corinthian church who were getting drunk at the Lord's Supper, did it? They were sick and they were dying. And we're going to talk a lot about that stuff in this program because we need wisdom. We need to understand these things. We are so, how would you say it? There's got to be a good way to say it, and I can't even think of it, but it's kind of like, we can't just discard what God says with no effect. It will have an effect on our life. And so if you think you're not under the law, you're under grace, and you think that that becomes your excuse or license to start breaking the law, you're foolish indeed. Because Satan will go to the Father just like he did with Peter. Now, what was Peter's? He didn't do anything that wrong, did he? Wait a minute. Do you remember what he said just prior to that statement from Jesus? Oh, Lord, I would go to death with his arrogance, his pride was so overwhelming. And Satan saw the pride in his heart and ran to his daddy and said, Father, did you not say under the law? And the father would say, well, it's true. That pride goeth before a fall. That, he is full of it, Father. You know what God says? You're right. He is. He's mine. And then Jesus, our advocate, stands before God and says, Lord, he's mine. Give him time, Father. Let me stand in the gap here. And so he tells Peter, when it's done, when you have returned from what? From being sifted, then you will be strengthened because I've interceded for you. Thank God we have an advocate. But we haven't understood this stuff. You understand? We get a lot of preaching, and listen, most of the preaching, and one of the reasons why this program is here, is to help us to understand how these seeming paradoxes can be reconciled. Because it is a paradox if you don't have the key to understanding to how we can be under grace and under law at the same time. Does that make sense? And you are, in fact, under both, but not at the expense of one over the other. You cannot do that. When you do that, you fall into error. That's when Satan has a field day in our lives. So look, if you think you can go off and just go, hey, it doesn't matter. Lord, I'm so glad I've never done those things. What things is that? Well, I've never committed adultery. Have you ever lusted in your heart? Jesus didn't just say the law is something that is up there, but it's in here. That his heart is that in our spirit that we learn how to yield to his rulership over us. And so Jesus wants us to have the Spirit of God, that Spirit of love, reign and rule over our heart. And then the enemy won't have access to your life. Because love is not going to do anything wrong. Love is not going to lust. Why? Because if I have my precious wife, I am going to love her, and when I feel that spirit of lust trying to get to me, I go, I recognize you, be gone in Jesus' name. We can literally fight a spiritual battle against the forces of darkness. But you know what's the problem in the church today? We don't know we're fighting truly spiritual forces in darkness. We don't understand these things. And so we're just like food for the fodder. You know, we are destroyed day and night because of a lack of the knowledge of how the spirit realm works. Every demon under the heavens has to gain permission from God to do what they do. It is not like we've been taught, like they're a big crazy bunch of wild-eyed crazies that are off doing their own thing. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every single one of them have to have authority from God to do what they do. And their authority doesn't come from any other place than what God has spoken into existence. And it goes back to the experiment. The experiment is, you can only operate under this. And the angels that were not put into chains and thrown into the pit, they know it. So don't think there isn't some part of the law that brings evil. And listen, the unfortunate part about evil is that the innocent always suffer. God was innocent of any wrongdoing or evil. And he had to, in a sense, sacrifice his own heart. Wow. The heart of God grieved to death over the loss of the babies. Can you hear a mother's heart in that? My babies, my babies. What babies? Yeah. Even the angels that were lost. That was no easy thing for God. Don't for a moment think that was anything that was easy for God to deal with. God's heart was broken, in a sense, for the loss of these children. And we don't understand a whole lot of stuff because we're so egocentric, we think it's all about us. There was a much bigger picture going on in the entire universe, but God did some really awesome things where we're concerned. So as we go through the summation, and I realize we're going to have two programs to do that summation, that sin created that paradox in love, and we talked about that. Sin caused God to separate the unfailing love from the protective love. And in this reality that if we understand grace and law, we'll understand that in an eternal sense, we are under God's grace. That grace is what keeps you saved for all eternity. That is the kindness, the goodness of God, that Jesus purchased us with his blood. But does it make sense? It absolutely does. We've not done a good job of explaining. God's gotten a bad rap from the world. Oh, if God is love. Do you understand that protective love is protective love? And it's different than the nurturing love. That's correct. That's correct. It's powerful. It's omnipotent. The love that is in God the Father is the kind of power that will utterly destroy the power of evil forever. And I can't wait. How about you? So we need to understand that these things are sensible, but they've been hidden, veiled, if you will, from us. And I believe it's a part of God's design that in the last days, the words that have been sealed, do you remember in the last part of Daniel where it says, these words are sealed when he didn't understand, and they will be sealed until the last days. When Jesus left the earth, he said a very strange thing to his disciples. He said, I have many more things to tell you, but right now you cannot bear them. And it's hard because what we're doing in this program is we're stretching your thinking about God. We've introduced you to the concept that love was divided. It is, in fact, the basis of understanding of how God can yet be loved but be manifested in different ways. Does that make sense? That in the spirit of wisdom that was brought forth out of God is the most precious love, the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is so pure, by the way, in his reality, that you cannot blaspheme the Spirit. You can blaspheme God, and you can blaspheme Jesus. Now, you understand, Jesus isn't, the Spirit that is in Jesus is this. But Jesus came much later. That Spirit was eventually placed into the human host of Jesus. We're so glad that you tuned in. Like us on Facebook and tune back in next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in today. For more content, downloads, and videos, visit us at brucescampbell.com. Join the conversation by searching Facebook for Bruce S. Campbell or Twitter at God Paradoxes. The Beginning, Prelude to the Apocalypse by Bruce S. Campbell is a story set in New Orleans about Enoch, one of the two witnesses found in the book of Revelation. What can these two witnesses tell us about the future of our world? Is Enoch superhuman, or is he just like you and I, walking out his faith but still full of questions? Is our faith full of paradoxes, and can they be answered? Find the answers in the new book by Bruce S. Campbell, The Beginning, Prelude to the Apocalypse, on sale now at brucescampbell.com and Amazon.